Hello, and welcome to Talk the Walk. I'm Azam Khan. A Russian superyacht that sailed into Hong Kong's Victoria Harbour last week and has been docked there since October 5th has triggered diplomatic tension. The superyacht is linked to Russian steel tycoon and close ally to Vladimir Putin, Alexei Mordashov, who has been sanctioned by the US, UK, and EU over Moscow's war with Ukraine. It wasn't long before the US issued strong statements towards Hong Kong over its decision to not to take action against the Russian floating asset, adding to a laundry list of recent disparagement toward the city from the US, typically over the national security law, but now relating to the Russia-Ukraine conflict. Joining us tonight to unpack the topic is former Director of Public Prosecutions of Hong Kong, Grenville Cross. Thank you for taking the time to speak with me, Mr. Cross.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
With regards to handling the Russian superyacht, Chief Executive John Lee said that Hong Kong does not follow unilateral sanctions, but abides by the United Nations laws and sanction laws as the actual legal basis. Is he right to say so?
Well, the whole episode, of course, is quite extraordinary. And I'm very surprised that before making those sort of comments, the United States State Department didn't check what the legal position is with the Consul General in Hong Kong, because the Consul General of the United States in Hong Kong would have been able to advise the State Department that under Hong Kong law, it's not possible to simply seize the assets of private citizens unless that is done pursuant to United Nations sanctions. And of course, Mr. Mordashov has not been sanctioned by the United Nations. He's only subject to sanctions from the United States and some of its allies. Of course, Hong Kong does have mechanisms in place for seizing assets of particular individuals. For example, under the Organized and Serious Crime Ordinance, criminal assets can be seized. Under the Dangerous Drugs Ordinance, drugs involved in trafficking can be seized. And under the Criminal Procedure Ordinance, criminal property can be forfeited. But no such mechanisms exist in relation to the yacht, the Nord, which is owned by Mr. Mordashov. That means, quite simply, that Hong Kong authorities cannot seize that yacht. They would not be able to get an order from the courts to justify them in seizing that yacht. And if they did seize the yacht in defiance of any proper legal standing, then Mr. Mordashov would be able to apply to the courts for a declaration that the seizure was illegal. So it could be seen that the responses given by the US State Department are ill thought out. They have no proper legal basis, and one is left with a distinct impression that the United States State Department is simply using this episode as another means of trying to embarrass Hong Kong.
Right. So you mentioned the United States State Department. They had gone so far as to imply that by not taking action against the yacht, that it further calls into question the transparency of the business environment in Hong Kong. Obviously, this joins a list of times the U.S. has attacked the city's credibility as a financial center recently. We'll go more into that later in the show. But what do you make of the connection they made with regards to the city's transparency?
Well, it's wholly bizarre. As I've explained, in most countries around the world, governments can only seize the property of private individuals if it's provided for by the law of the land, and it's not provided for in Hong Kong. It's certainly true that another smaller yacht that Mr. Mordashov owns was seized in Italy, but that was only because Italy is part of the European Union, which has itself imposed sanctions on particular individuals in Russia. There is no such legal basis in Hong Kong, and for the United States to come out with these inflammatory remarks is frankly the height of irresponsibility. We are ruled by the rule of law here in Hong Kong. We have due process. Things must be done in a legal way. And if the government wants to move against particular individuals, it has to have the authority of the legislature to do so. But in fact, the business environment in Hong Kong is healthy. The prospects, despite the COVID pandemic, remain good. And it's interesting to note that only last month, the Fraser Institute, in its latest report on economic freedom around the world, adjudged Hong Kong to be the world's freest economy, well ahead of the United States, which was at seventh place. So to answer your question, I see this as being part of an overall strategy to try and strike at China by trying to embarrass Hong Kong and to undermine its status in the financial world. And of course, Hong Kong is very shortly going to host a major financial summit on the November the 2nd, which will be attended by bankers from around the world. And I would have thought this was a powerful affirmation of the confidence which the business community around the world has in Hong Kong's future and potential.
Right, you mentioned the summit that's coming up, but do you think all of this will make it tougher for Hong Kong business environment to get back on track now that Hong Kong is trying to do just that with the COVID restrictions easing, with the summits and everything coming up?
Well, that's certainly the intention. But we have to put these latest remarks by the United States State Department in their overall context. You may remember that in 2020, the United States adopted some highly hostile measures towards Hong Kong, which were designed to damage it economically. The then president, Donald Trump, ended the Hong Kong's trading preferences to the United States. He decreed that in future, Hong Kong products could no longer bear the label made in Hong Kong when they were exported to the United States, and he even sanctioned 11 officials. At the time, you may recall that Mr. Trump actually said that these measures would ensure that the Hong Kong economy failed. And he then said that the Hong Kong markets would quote, go to hell, because no one would want to do business there. Well, of course, those gloomy prophecies did not come to pass, and Hong Kong was able to bounce back despite the efforts of Donald Trump and his compatriots. And indeed, because they had failed, you must remember that in July 2021, the new president, Joseph Biden, issued a Hong Kong travel advisory. And in that advisory, he warned US businesses about the threats and the dangers of doing business in Hong Kong, which was yet another attempt to undermine Hong Kong economically and thereby to damage China as a whole. And it was very interesting, I found, that by and large, the American Chamber of Commerce did not associate itself with either the actions taken by Trump or the actions taken by his successor, and they remained, in general terms, fairly confident about the future of Hong Kong, because they are realistic people. They understand the position here on the ground, and they know that people in Washington are just playing political games of their own. So given that the fact that all the attempts to undermine Hong Kong economically over the last 2 years have come to nothing, despite the best efforts of the people in Washington, I remain confident that Hong Kong can weather whatever storms may lie on the horizon.
Yeah, I can't help but think that this reminds me of the time when Edward Snowden came to the city some years ago to seek temporary asylum from Hong Kong. Is there some similarity in that?
You may recall the details of that case. The United States did ask for Mr. Snowden to be seized and extradited to the United States. But it was found out that the documents which were submitted by the United States Department of Justice were defective. And so the then Secretary of Justice, Mr. Rimsky-Yoon, pointed this out and asked for them to be corrected. But before this was done, Mr. Snowden left the jurisdiction. But at least at that time, in the Snowden case, there was some legal basis for the request which the United States was making. The request this time has no legal base whatsoever, and is clearly an affront to criminal justice and is contrary to the rule of law, which requires that governments only act on the basis of legal authorizations.
Right. So obviously, this is all part and parcel with the West's larger tension towards China. How do you think Hong Kong has been handling that barrage?
Well, as I said just now, I think that Hong Kong has done extremely well. It's kept its nerve. It hasn't allowed itself to be deflected by the hostile actions which have been taken against it. COVID apart, it has remained open for business. It's done its best to identify its future in terms of being a technology hub, a financial center, and so on. and it's indicated that it will be taking full advantage of the greater possibilities for integration, which are now opening up on the Greater Bay Area. So rather than just simply sitting back and simply taking it on the chin, Hong Kong has stood up for itself and shown that it won't be pushed around, which is no mean feat for a small place like this.
Right. So you don't think there's anything else that Hong Kong could have done to basically remove itself from the crosshairs of the U.S. right now and the UK? There's nothing more that it could have done.
Well, I mean, Hong Kong can only act in accordance with the law. And as I've explained, the laws do not allow Hong Kong to seize other people's assets. The international order has to be respected. And it's very important that Hong Kong remains true to its fundamentals. With the support of Beijing, of course, does not allow itself to be pushed around by people who have ulterior motives and aren't really concerned about the well-being of Hong Kong, but are more concerned with pursuing a political agenda of their own, which is to try and harm China.
I'll have to stop you there for a moment, Mr. Cross, as we take a quick break. Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back with former Director of Public Prosecutions of Hong Kong, Grenville Cross, to get his thoughts on John Lee's decision to postpone Hong Kong's own national security legislation. Welcome back to Talk the Walk with me. I'm Azam Khan. For those of you who are just tuning in, I'm speaking to former Director of Public Prosecutions of Hong Kong, Grenville Cross. Mr. Cross, last week the U.S. Congressional Executive Commission on China, a panel set up directly to advise U.S. Congress on matters pertaining to China, had released a report accusing Hong Kong authorities of smothering civil society. And the Hong Kong government responded by saying that the report is biased. The commission is made up of familiar U.S. politicians who have a history of taking a certain stance against China, like Marco Rubio. But this commission obviously holds influence in Washington. But in your opinion, what do you make of this development?
Well, this commission has, over the years, shown itself to be so hostile towards China and indeed Hong Kong that anything it says cannot any longer be taken seriously. It is a highly partisan group, and it is part of the movement in the United States to try and undermine China and to halt its progress in world affairs. Anything it says about Hong Kong is not for the benefit of Hong Kong. It's actually calculated to harm China as a whole. You may remember, for example, that members of this committee in 2018 actually nominated leaders of the 2014 protest movement for the Nobel Peace Prize. And they actually told the Peace Prize Committee in Oslo that the three individuals in question had advanced peaceful democracy in Hong Kong. But what they failed to disclose to the committee was that the three individuals in question had actually been convicted of an unlawful assembly involving violence, which left 10 people injured. This was deliberately withheld from the committee, but before it made any decision. Fortunately, the committee was able to find out what the actual position was. And of course, it rejected the recommendation by the members of this commission that the prize be awarded to those individuals. More recently, of course, in this year, the commission members have also made recommendations to President Joe Biden that sanctions be imposed upon judges of Hong Kong, as well as upon prosecutors in Hong Kong, which is a direct and calculated affront to the rule of law and in violation of international legal norms. It is frankly contemptible that the judiciary should be attacked in this way, as well as our prosecution service. And I have to say that we can't expect too much from the United States because it has a record of indulging in this type of hostile activity. In 2020, for example, in a brazen example of contempt for the rule of law, President Donald Trump imposed sanctions on the chief prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, who was appointed by the United Nations and operates under the Rome Statute of the United Nations. The chief prosecutor's crime was to want an investigation into alleged crimes against humanity, and war crimes committed allegedly committed by United States troops and personnel in Afghanistan. So even though the chief prosecutor of the International Criminal Court was discharging her mandate, which had been given to her by the United Nations, the United States still felt able to impose sanctions upon her, her family, her deputy, and her deputy's family, which was an utter disgrace and spitting in the face of international criminal justice. So we have to accept that these type of mindsets do prevail in the United States. They must be called out whenever they are discerned, and people who believe in the rule of law must make their voices heard. So it's certainly worrying that people like this commission are making hostile remarks against Hong Kong and indeed against China, but we must hope that wiser counsels will prevail in the White House. And indeed, I do note that even though the call for sanctions to be imposed on Hong Kong judges was made earlier this year, President Joe Biden has apparently disregarded what they had to say, and I hope that everyone else will likewise be similarly sensible.
Right. As you know, that the Hong Kong government had recently decided to postpone its own legislation on national security, citing further research and just taking care of other priorities first, before diving into the complexity of the legislation and rather than rushing it. So what do you make of that decision by the administration?
Well, I think we have to place this issue in context. It is, of course, 25 years since the reunification, and Hong Kong has managed to survive for those 25 years without these items of national security legislation having been implemented. That doesn't mean that the matter can be delayed indefinitely, but it certainly needs to be dealt with in the fairly near future. But to put the matter in its overall context, when the National People's Congress enacted the national security law for Hong Kong in 2020, it adopted a minimalist approach. It only enacted those laws which were then and there necessary in order to combat the insurrection that was gripping Hong Kong at that time. It therefore only covered subversion, treason, secession, and collusion with foreign powers. The other outstanding matters have been left for Hong Kong itself to implement when the time is right, and the mainland has nonetheless made clear that this should be as soon as possible. That having been said, and this is a great show of faith in Hong Kong that Beijing has taken that attitude, that having been said, the job must obviously not be rushed. There has to be full consideration of what is required. From what various government sources have said, it may be necessary to deal not only with treason and with sedition and theft of state secrets, but perhaps even matters relating to cyberspace and such matters, procedural matters, as how long particular suspects should be detained and where they should be detained. I don't know the inside of it, but I would imagine that these are the type of matters which are being considered, and this will require a close examination of how other jurisdictions, particularly in the Far East, handle these type of crimes, these type of issues. So it's obviously best that when the law is finally submitted to the Legislative Council, it be foolproof, that there be no lacunae in it, and that it be one that can stand up to possible challenge in the courts in due course. So it's far better to have a properly reasoned and a properly thought out bill in due course, rather than one which is perhaps botched and rushed. And I'm sure that will have been a major consideration of the government in choosing not to bring it forward at this time, though I would expect it to be brought forward sometime in the next 12 months.
Mr. Cross, I also wanted to get your opinion on another recent example of the Five Eyes collectively taking action towards Hong Kong regarding the national security law, involving the former politician turned fugitive Ted Hui, who was sentenced by the Hong Kong High Court a couple of weeks ago while he was absent from the city. And I believe he had first gone to Denmark and then went to the UK and then ultimately has settled now in Australia. So what do you make of that situation?
Well, it's another extraordinary incident. He was a man who had a serious criminal record in Hong Kong, who was accused of various crimes, some involving violence, some involving perverting the course of public justice, some involving criminal damage. A man who lied to the courts of Hong Kong in order to be allowed to leave Hong Kong, and who should have been treated with great disdain by everybody who believes in criminal justice and the rule of law. Instead of which, he was welcomed with open arms when he arrived in the West, and he was seen as a useful tool in their propaganda war against Hong Kong and indeed against China as a whole. So it's a classic example of the values going out of the window for what is regarded as political expediency, which is very sad indeed, because we hear so much from the West about upholding the international rules-based order. And this is a classic example of that rules-based order being trashed by someone whose conduct is highly reprehensible.
Right. And finally, I wanted to get your opinion on John Lee's policy address, which is to take place next week. Did you have any expectations or hopes regarding the address?
Well, I think many people have high hopes of this. The signs are that it's going to be a very positive policy address. I was particularly pleased that Mr. Lee announced a few days ago that the plan is to fast-track legislation for the mandatory reporting of child abuse in Hong Kong. This is very good news because the child abuse figures are very distressing. The Social Welfare Department recently revealed that there was an increase of 45% in reported child abuse cases in 2021 over the previous year. On top of that, in areas not concerning young people, I would like to see a fake news law being introduced, as this will help to prevent the type of abuses that we saw in 2019-2020, when falsehoods were openly spread on the internet and elsewhere, causing dissension, causing concern, and causing hatred. Another area I would like to see progress on is in relation to the criminal intimidation of judges and also prosecutors. We've seen quite a few cases in recent times where judges have been threatened and intimidated by people because of the way in which they have handled the cases arising out of the social disturbances. This is clearly intolerable, but the maximum sentence for this offence is only 5 years in prison. And I would hope that that could be considerably enhanced, because while it is still quite a low sentence, it's not going to have any real deterrent effect. Another possible area might be discrimination against mainland Chinese. When the race discrimination ordinance was originally introduced, it did not cover mainland Chinese people and Chinese from other parts of the country. And it was thought that was not necessary at the time. But recent experiences have shown that people from other parts of the country have suffered real hardships because of where they come from. They have been denied access to restaurants, for example. They've been abused in public places, and they've suffered various humiliations. So in my view, the ordinance should be reformed, and indeed the Commissioner himself has recommended that there should be a reform, and I would like to see this type of conduct prohibited, as well as other types of objectionable behaviour towards women, minority groups, and others.
I believe that's all the time we have. Mr. Cross, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you the same time next week. Goodbye.